The diner sat at the edge of Route 9 like an old friend, neon blinking awake, chrome parked in a loose circle outside, coffee steam rising in thin ghosts from ceramic mugs. Morning smelled of grease and gasoline, bacon and rain that had passed in the night. Men in leather leaned on their bikes, hands warm on handlebars, the conversation low and easy. Mason Cole watched the steam curl from his cup, thumb tracing the faded edges of a red and white patch on his jacket. He had a way of looking as if he belonged to two places at once, the road and wherever someone needed him. Then a sound cut the day in half. A little body burst through the diner's door, the bell jangling like a warning. She wore a red dress too big for her shoulders, hair matted from crying, hand clenched on nothing at all. Her voice was small and raw, but it carried like a bell across the parking lot. "They're beating my father!" Silence fell like a hand. Cups paused halfway to mouths. Engines idled and then stilled. People who had come to keep their distance from troubles that smelled like trouble found themselves frozen. For a moment, the only thing powerful enough to move anyone was that child's fear. Mason's coffee went cold in his hand. He moved without thinking, kneeling to be level with her, voice lowered and certain. "Hey," he said, "what's your name?" "Hannah," she said between sobs, fingers working at the hem of her dress. "Over by the trailers, number 7. Mason took Hannah's small, shaking hand. He asked one more thing, and she told him who was there, the slurred name, the sound she'd heard through the thin walls. He stood, palms flat on the hood of a bike. Tank and the two brothers, Eli and Jonah, were already glancing toward the trailers, boots finding their spurs. Mason didn't question whether to go. He decided how to go. "Stay with Marlene," he told Hannah, nodding toward the diner owner, who had suddenly was at the doorway, her apron still tied, but eyes awake and fierce. "Lock the door if you need to. We're right back." There was a low growl as engines answered the call. Chrome flashed. Tires bit pavement. Mason swung his leg over, the jacket creaking like a promise. The group's movement snapped the city's little inertia. Where most people walked away, they turned the key and rode toward danger. If this story matters to you, hit like. It's a reminder that help can come from unexpected places. They rode hard, but they rode within reason, the way people do when they want to get somewhere fast without becoming the problem. The trailers were a cluster of aluminum and thin wood behind a coppice of sycamores, paint peeling like old scabs. Voices rose through a cracked window, an uneven chorus of shouting and pleading. Mason paused at the trailer door and listened. Inside, a man staggered, fists pounding on another man who curled and tried to shield himself. It wasn't a fight of equals. The attacker smelled of cheap liquor and old grievances. His anger was less a reason than a force with its own momentum. The one on the floor, Hannah's father, was younger than Mason expected, face streaked with stubble and clear lines of someone who had been trying to hold a life together. He was not heroic in any cartoons of violence. He was human and vulnerable, the center of a child's terror. Mason's voice moved through the doorway. "Hey, enough!" It was short and steady. The man swung at him, clumsy, blown wide by drink, but Mason didn't dance. Tank and the brothers were inside in a sweep, hands aimed to separate and contain. They used grips, not knives, angles and weight, not cruelty. The attacker shoved and cursed. They turned him gently to the floor and pinned arms behind his back until he stopped thrashing. No broken bones, no show of dominance, just firm, practiced restraint. Someone on the other side of the thin walls had already called 911. A neighbor, a trucker who'd been napping in his rig, had heard the child's voice and dialed while pulling on boots. The sound of sirens threaded through the trees like a second, safer kind of thunder. Mason made sure the father could breathe, rolled him onto one side, checked for signs of worse injuries. The father's hands trembled. He blinked at Mason as if seeing him for the first time. "My girl," he said, voice quiet, more apology than explanation. The bikers did what they'd come to do: stop the harm. They did not take retribution. They kept hands visible when the police arrived, stepped back when officers asked them to, and told the truth to a woman in a dark uniform with a pad and a calm voice. The attacker answered for himself as officers read rights. Cuffs clicked. A neighbor gave a statement. Mason gave his. Statements didn't fix everything, but they fixed the first legal step: accountability. Back at the diner, Hannah's trembling slowed as the adrenaline thinned from her limbs. Marlene wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and set a mug of warm cocoa in front of her with two hands that had steady experience in patching up all kinds of hurts. The father sat at a corner booth, jacket bunched under his head as he tried to stanch the shaking, pain like a bruise that would take days to settle. No one asked him for his story right away. For a while, people offered quiet things: sugar and patience, coffee, and the kind of kindness that didn't pry. The rest of the day moved like someone else was driving the town. People emerged from behind their routines and offered what they could. A trucker left a bag of groceries at the diner's back door. A neighbor offered the use of a spare room for a few nights while things settled. Someone texted a local shelter number, and another offered to take Hannah to school for the afternoon. Mason stayed long enough to make sure Hannah could speak without the knot in her throat swallowing her words. He sat at the booth near the window, where he could see his bike and the patch on his chest in the glass, an odd little badge of responsibility he never wanted to abuse. News moved through the town in human ways: hands and notes, murmurs over counters, practical help more than gossip. The father accepted a blanket and a cup of strong coffee from Marlene, and, after some insistence from people who wouldn't take his refusal personally, allowed a volunteer from the shelter to come by that evening. There would be paperwork, a police report, and the slow, uncertain work of repair. No one pretended there was a quick fix, but there were neighbors who knew how to keep showing up. Over the following weeks, the bikers' involvement settled into a rhythm that refused to make news. They were not saviors. They were steady extras in a domestic scene that needed more than a dramatic rescue. It needed continuity. Tank delivered a box of canned goods and a sack of rice. Eli and Jonah brought over a small space heater when the weather dropped. Mason learned the father's name, Tom, and sat with him once, 2 hours in a booth after closing, while Tom spoke in fits about bills and shame and the drinking that had crept in like a shadow. Mason listened. He did not judge. He offered what he could: a number for counseling, rides to a support group, a promise that someone would check on Hannah if Tom needed time to sort his own steps. Sometimes care is small and therefore fierce. On a cold night, Mason found Tom asleep on the diner's back porch, a blanket tucked up to his chin. He wrapped another over him, untouched and shy as charity, and left it without explanation. The next week, Tom showed up at the diner's door with work gloves and a faint, lopsided smile, ready to help stack firewood. The gesture meant more than Mason cared to say. Repair wasn't always about grand epiphanies. It was about steady, unglamorous presence. Hannah carried her own fear like a stone in her pocket. She sat up front in the booth, coloring without looking at the paper, slow-eyed. One afternoon, she slid a crayon creation across the table to Mason. It was a child's rendering. Motorcycles like ovals with lines for spokes, a small figure labeled Dad, and another figure with a patch-shaped blob on his chest, kneeling and holding a child's hand. In the corner, someone had tried to write "Thank you," but the letters leaned like saplings. Mason folded the drawing gently, as if it might tear. He tucked it into his vest where the patch sat and let the paper warm against his ribs. It became a talisman, less for himself than for the reminder that the life they'd stopped had a beating heart, a daughter who trusted someone enough to scream, and a community that chose not to look away. Weeks later, the legal system moved at its slow, rigid pace. An arrest, a hearing, the uncertain calculus of charges and outcomes. Mason did not expect miracles from courts. He expected that the man who had caused harm would be held to account, that Tom might begin to rebuild with supports in place. That was the line they had drawn that day. Immediate protection followed by lawful process. Vigilantism had not been a part of the plan, and the town's choices had reflected that. The bikers had intervened to stop harm and then deferred to institutions whose job it was to do the long administrative work of justice. The more lasting work happened in ordinary gestures. The diner became a second living room for Tom and Hannah for a while. Marlene found a school counselor who would talk with Hannah and help her name what had happened. A local church pantry supplied meals. The bikers kept their promise of visits. Unannounced coffees, an extra burger at the counter, someone always available to pick up a broken heater or transport Tom to an appointment. Those small returns of time and attention mattered, laying a different kind of foundation than the adrenaline of a rescue. On the day the town held a small community meeting to talk about safety and resources, Hannah handed Mason another drawing. This one had more detail. People lined up as if holding hands, a sun with big rays, and a figure in the middle marked with the patch again, but this time smiling. Mason watched her hands as she gave it, the serious importance of a child investing her symbols with meaning. He kissed the top of her head, quick and awkward, like a man not used to softness. Mason kept that second drawing with him on long rides. The paper creased and a little smudged from the sweat of summer and the damp of rain. It slid into a pocket and stayed, a reminder that appearances were shallow and that the job of being human sometimes looked like tuning an engine and other times like making tuna fish sandwiches for a boy finding his footing. The town did not pretend everything was healed. Tom had hard nights and harder days. There were setbacks. There were meetings and forms and a counseling appointment attended with the reluctant courage of someone learning new muscles. But the line between a life fractured and a life mended is not a single event. It's the sum of being seen, of having people who won't leave, and of a system that won't let violence be a private secret. Mason never sought praise. The patch on his jacket collected the dust of the road and the handprints of people who had left small gifts. Homemade cookies, a chipped mug that Hannah insisted they both drink from. When he finally sat on his bike one morning to ride out, he felt the weight of the creased drawing against his chest, and smiled with the kind of small private satisfaction that doesn't need an audience. Years after that morning, when a faded photograph sometimes slid from the lining of his vest, a paper with fat crayon strokes and the words, "Thank you," in seedling letters, Mason thought of the day a child's voice made a town move, and how a group that looked dangerous to some had simply chosen, in a quiet and decisive way, to be there. If this moved you, share it, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done in that parking lot?